Since then, he's been a major research funder for agencies in Washington, and possibly most relevantly to his title, and probably known to most of you already, he is one of the original authors with Tim Berners-Lee of the Semantic Web paper in 2000. When I thought what to say, I thought, my God, it's as long ago, the Semantic Web paper, as the web was before that. I think the Semantic Web was yesterday, but it's halfway back. It's extraordinary thought. Jim is the man, and he's going to give us a talk.
So, before I start the talk, let me put it in some context. That, like most of us, there's sort of two talks I give. My bread and butter talk about what my lab is really doing, and our technology, and actually I got three. And then one that's kind of the what is the semantic web and things like that, which I'm so bored of because I've been giving it for 10 years that I decided not to anymore. In fact, this talk is the first talk I've given in 10 years that doesn't have anything about the semantic web explicitly in it. It was originally had a different title that said, I forget which one I sent here, but it more or less said, From Semantic Web to Social Machine, and I realized that was the only use of the term in the whole talk, so I took it out. But it's, as Jörg said, I started doing what we now call linked data in the semantic web a long time ago, and I was very lucky because it became exciting and fun and, a great field, and my students still do a lot of it. In fact, we're doing a lot of stuff with government data, and I realized that in this particular lab, my day job talk would probably have been very appropriate. So I'm happy to take questions about some of that stuff and get into that if we need. It's not really in this talk. This is more the vision talk about an idea that's been brewing in my head, some other people I've worked with for a pretty long time now. We actually had a proposal in on it a few years ago. Didn't get funded, tried to keep it. We had a lot of very good people who've got excited about it. There's been a couple workshops and things, but which never really came together until a few months ago, where I got some data, which I'll talk about a little bit, about some things going on in China and stuff that convinced me it was time to start really revisiting this stuff a little harder. So it really is in some ways more of a vision talk than a research talk. And although I'll cover some research. And the other thing is, I particularly wanted to give it here because it's all about stuff that I don't know how to do, right? And I hope nobody knows how to do, because it really requires a significantly different interaction that happens at very few places, here's being one of them, between the sort of technical side of the world and the social side of the world, right? And the term social machine has been used for this. So let me start with, it's not really a definition, but what I mean. So in Weaving the Web, Tim had a line sort of very close to the end of the book, usually people had stopped reading it by then, that said, real life is and must be full of all kinds of social constraint, the very processes from which society arises. Computers can help if we use them to create abstract social machines on the web, processes in which the people do the creative work and the machine does the administration. The stage is set for an evolutionary growth of new social machines. Now, there's two actually things interesting in here. One is notice the constant repetition of social machines. So from computing technology and the social aspects of this. And that's what I'm really going to talk a lot about today, sort of in the what's happening on two different sides and what would be interesting to have better insights into in pulling them together. The other one is, it didn't hit me until actually I was getting the slides finished up the other day, that this says evolutionary growth. I'm so used to Tim saying revolutionary that I never really thought about it. But in point of fact, evolutionary is exactly the word we're after here. So the question is, how can a community come together for a task and then essentially evolve their governance and their social relations and things like that in such a way that the machine helps support it, right? So Tim wrote this quote. The book showed up in '99. Most of the writing was 97, 98. So this was before, sort of the age of the social machine. So you could argue that by that definition, these things are very early social machines, right? They're Facebook, Twitter, those things. They're all about using a machine to support what people do, but there's nothing purposive in a sense to some of the work on it. So they're they kind of feel like the definition, but sort of the social kind of is emergent, and the machine is kind of fairly traditional web stuff, right? So it doesn't feel like you've seen a really big change, but also you don't feel like you could build your own to go do something unless someone else has done stuff. So the question I started thinking about, Tim was involved in this, John Kleinberg and Louis Van Ahn were also involved. So people who know them, of that group, I'm the one who doesn't have the MacArthur Genius Award. So, my job was to try to listen and synthesize and turn it into some kind of coherent form. But this number changes depending where you look and what you look at. But about 21% to 25% of the world's population is estimated to have used the web. And I think if I was in most other audiences, I would really try to push home to you how big that number is, because it doesn't sound that big as a 25%, but that's more people than have read a book. That's more people than have seen a book, right? That's 2 to 3 times the number of people who have indoor plumbing, right, as a percentage world, according to various figures. And of course, most of them are out of date, so it's very hard to make these comparisons. But when you look at a website applied in this world, and with that many people on it, so Facebook alone reports, if you go to their statistics page and do the math, 4 billion minutes, so that's 4 US billion, so 4,000 million minutes per day of human time. So to put that in perspective, that's 7,500 person years every day. And I finally found a metric that helped me put that number in perspective, which is IBM has 400,000 employees worldwide. If you do the math on IBM's payroll, it comes to a little less than 7,500 person years per year. Right? So every day on Facebook, people sort of do stuff as much as all the IBM employees do in a whole year. But again, IBM is selling things, building things, designing things, is known as a very innovative company. Facebook, a very small proportion of that 400 million user base, does anything to Facebook. Right, so most people don't change Facebook much. Now, there are other sites, and I'll talk about some of them in a minute, where there's much more interaction, and that's really what the social machine is. But my question as an engineer, and you can do it from a social perspective or from other perspectives, could we create technologies that make it possible to harness portions of that time and effort to solve real-world problems? And the definition of real-world problem here can be, fairly small or fairly big. So, since there's a vision talk, I put big numbers and big vision in here. But we're in a world where hundreds of millions of people could effectively network together, could get access to data archives from science, government, NGOs, things like that, working together on the web to do things we're not doing on the web right now, curing disease, feeding the hungry. So there are health sites, but most of them yet are not you don't see the coevolution of the site and the community, right? You don't see a governance structure in place. So there's a site called Patients Like Me where you say, I have this, and it tries to find you other patients, and then you can join chat rooms with them, which is sort of Facebook stuff, right? Which is useful, but there's not a lot of now doctors are starting to look at that site, but there's not a lot. And it would be very hard, for example, to imagine a doctor using patients, not me, to say, have any of you ever tried this drug and what happened? But in fact, an off-use of a drug, to do a clinical trial of that can cost millions and millions of dollars. To ask millions of people and get at least a first feel of whether it helped or not could cost almost nothing if you could get to the right people, ask the right questions, get the right interaction, et cetera, et cetera. So a few years ago when we started talking about this, it really had this science fiction-y feel to it. From the science fiction of 10, 20 years, pre-web science fiction, the Welcome to the Goldfish Bowl and other famous stories. But it's now starting to happen, and there's really 2 approaches. I would say that the prevalent approach is actually what you might call doing this by accident. Okay, so this is a famous example of this. Google correlated the 50 most search terms that correlate with somebody having the flu, headache, muscle ache, influenza, whatever, and plotted them over time, and then the gold is the CDC data about flu outbreaks. And I mean, you can see that the data searches of humanity seem to very nicely meet this flu data. Now, there's a couple problems with this that aren't, this is often held up as this really stunning example of how powerful this stuff is. One of the things that happens is if you go beyond 50 terms, some of my students tried this informally because you can't get your hands on all of Google's data, so you got to sort of fool around through their API. But if you start going to 75 or 100 terms, it doesn't work very well. Words become more and more ambiguous if you go down and correlate with more things. So you lose the signal if you don't guess exactly the right number. And the second thing is if you look carefully, the blue is almost always behind the yellow. So you're not getting any kind of predictive power of the flu. What you can say is, yes, using Google, we can see where the flu was reported to have broken out yesterday.
Well, is that when the CDC reported the data, or when they said it happened?
I thought this was the happening. This is the So
Google
later CDC went back, and so at the end of the year when CDC said here's where and when things happened, what the flu looked like last year. That's the orange line. So it's not when CDC said it. What I mean is that the CDC outbreaks came before the Google searches, right? Would be much more exciting. I like to say that.
But Google predicted before CDC was saying.
Right.
Well, no, Google reported before CDC was saying.
Yeah.
Google didn't predict.
No,
That's the
okay,
point I'm making.
sorry.
So again, my quick slogan on this one is. Yesterday's stock market returns are not worth very much to you. Tomorrow's would be worth a whole lot more, right? So the fact that when we look at old stock market thing, we can see stock market trends is interesting if you could use them to predict markets, which has almost always failed, right? It would be much more interesting. So in a sense, we're not quite seeing the ability yet to take some of these. Now, there are some very interesting going on. Microsoft invests huge amount of money in this stuff. Does things like they have every GPS report in the Seattle area and who's where and what cars are where, and so they can correlate. So they can say, today your recommended route home is, right? So again, so you can get stuff and learn stuff and find stuff in the data. But imagine trying to say, how would we design one of these? Because people in Oxford would like to get home faster on their bicycles, right? It's not quite the same thing. You can't just say, well, we'll just instrument everybody in town, wait 3 years, and run some great learning algorithm, right? You would think it should be different than that, okay? Now, there are some other ones that have been much more successful from the point of view I'm talking about. This is Louis van Aan, you've probably seen this, where you sort of prove you're a human by typing 2 words. Most of you have probably not clicked on the little reCAPTCHA thing here to see the information. So I have the unknowingly up here in quotes because Louis gets very mad at me when I say it because, he has exactly exposed everything they're doing, nobody's being tricked, et cetera, and he's right, but most people have never looked at it because it's a very low effort to do this thing and you have a value to doing it. But in fact, what's happening is one of these words has been picked at random from the dictionary, and one of them is picked from an old document where they're trying to do where they're trying to do character recognition. It's hard because the document is gray or things like that. And so if you get this word right, that would be some evidence that would admit you as a person, and then they would check to see if you got what you said that word is. If that word, starts to have lots and lots of people saying it's morning, then they'll know that that's the word morning, right? If a lot of and there may be some ambiguous word with it, and if people start typing that a lot. So again, so they're correlating. So I think the most interesting thing about this one is that 400 million individuals as of 2008 had used this thing. So again, not necessarily unique individuals, but probably separate IP addresses. So that meant people had, and I forget, he has curves, you can find them in the papers I cite, which will tell you the percentage of, better optical character recognition has gotten. So it's a very, very clever thing he's done, okay? he's also very, he's also the guy who came up with the idea of games with a purpose, which I expect a lot of you have heard about. The idea is, the most famous one is you get a picture and you're teamed with someone else, and the faster the two of you can come up with the same word describing that picture, the more points you get. There are stop words there, so it says, you're not allowed, so if I show you a picture of a person, it could say, you're not allowed to use person, man, or blonde. So now you have to get to some other image features. And it has some very interesting things. It's very good for getting certain kinds of features. It's not so good for other features. And if you're looking for individual recognition, my picture is not likely to have lots and lots of random people around the world know who it is, right? If that was the president of the U.S. or your prime minister, a lot more people would know who it is, right? And then it would be real recognition. So the tagging is still, the quality of the tags is a lot to be discussed. But Google funded some of that work, and actually it's claimed that it's rumored that Google image search uses the results of that. Again, neither Google nor Lewis will say much about it. And he has a bunch of others. Now they're doing it for music recognition. So again, if you can get lots of terms about things, it turns out you can build recommender systems and a lot of things and tagging systems and stuff like that. So it's really, impressive stuff, and a lot of people use it, although it's still a little bit of a black art. And what I mean by that is, I was telling someone yesterday that as far as I knew, Lewis was the only one who had ever actually defined one that got heavily used. And they said, no, there's this one other guy who has a little company in San Francisco who's been pretty successful. It's certainly not the case that anyone who wants to build one of these, it's easy to design, right? But it's an intriguing idea from a lot of reasons. Another one I want to point out is something called Galaxy Zoo. Galaxy Zoo, several schools, including this one, have been heavily involved in the work. Basically, the Sloan Sky Survey takes pictures every night of swaths of the sky, very deep swaths. So they see lots and lots of galaxies. And one of the interesting astronomical questions is what kind are they and how do they distribute and things like that. And the problem is building a computer program to recognize the kinds of galaxies is very, very difficult. But it turns out people do it very easily. So you go to this site, if you register, you take about a 5 or 10 minute training where it teaches you to register galaxies. And then anytime you have some spare time, you can go to the site and say, I'll register some galaxies. Right, and then it'll show you one, and you click it and say it's this kind, and it's about three clicks deep. So first you pick the type, and then it says, okay, is it this orientation or that orientation? Then it says this type or that type. Okay, they've had hundreds of thousands of people who have classified millions of galaxies, right, to date. So it's been a tremendously successful project. In fact, that was in 2008. I just recently sent Radek a question asking how many they got, and he hasn't answered me yet. Here's the most famous story about Galaxy Zoo. It's about, my Dutch is probably worse than anyone, so I won't try to pronounce it right, but this word means object, essentially, or thing. So it's Hanny's object. Okay? So at some point in time, this woman, Hanny van Arkel, was shown this picture. And one of the things you can do in Galaxy Zoo is you can ask a question about the picture and sort of send it to a blog. Actual astronomers will eventually look at the ones that kind of percolate up as interesting. And she said, watch this green thing. I've been doing a lot of these, I've never seen one of these. And once it got to the astronomers, they said, what's this green thing? We've been doing this for a long time, and we don't know what it is. And I could actually give you the astronomical explanation because I had because I heard a talk about it. But roughly speaking, it's a reflection of the gases that were created at the time that that a nova happened somewhere, reflecting off of the galaxy or something. So it was actually an interesting astronomical thing. It's known as a quasar light echo nowadays. And that's the official paper on it, and the first major astronomical thing. The fourth author is Hanny. I really love it because if you read this says Department of Physics, Oxford, Yale University, major universities, and her affiliation is Netherlands school system. She's a elementary school teacher. Right now it's a good amusing. It's kind of an amusing anecdote, but in a certain sense, it's also the whole point of this, right, is somehow this person who has no astronomical training, but using this system made a significant contribution to what was eventually what was eventually, some important astronomy. So I say, in some ways maybe it's a digression because it's about one person out of that 100,000. But on the other hand, that also talks a lot to the motivation of people doing this. It's I'm helping astronomers. I'm doing something of value, right? So I'll say this a few times as I go along. But one of the things we really know very little about is what incentivizes people to do any of this stuff at a high level. At a low level. So there's been lots of post hoc studies of systems which said, in this one the incentive was this, or in this one the incentive was that. I was saying to Bill today, but if you read across those, you don't see a whole lot of papers that let you figure out which one you would use for a new system, or, the very high level things are things like money or kudos are kind of hard to say, well, but how much and how do you harness those and how do you expose them? Games with a purpose, for example, if it didn't have score, Lewis thinks nobody would play it. He hasn't proved that, he hasn't done the study, but he says anecdotally, getting people to want to do your thing is the main part of the success. So one of the things that's very interesting, and this was really what got this stuff back on my research horizon, was that some colleagues of mine a few months ago from China, there's Fei Yu Wang and Daniel Zhang and a few other people, Chinese Academy of Science and Arizona State University, had collected a whole lot of data about a Chinese search phenomena called human flesh search engine. What's very interesting is every time I give this talk, right, since I mostly talk to Occidental audiences, which have a few Chinese students in it, the Chinese students usually do this and the others either do that or look bemused. It's very well known, but strangely enough, it's a phenomenon that happens a whole lot in China, but not much, a small percentage elsewhere. The other thing that's interesting about it is that the media has had a terrible perception of what this thing is. Part of it because it has this horrible name. That name is essentially the word-for-word direct translation as I understand it, because I don't speak the language. But I worked with some colleagues sort of back and forth to see if we could come up with a good term, and people-powered search is actually a much better translation. Unfortunately, human flesh search is a lot sexier, so that's what's going on. In fact, Law and Order had a chapter about it. In Law and Order, it was about some people going out and using this thing to commit a homicide. So very weird, because it's primarily not used in sort of that negative construct. This was very interesting. So the first time I ever talked about this in public was last Friday. And this Sunday, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine, a 6-page article about the human flesh search engine. So I'm really annoyed. If I had published a month ago, I might have made it into the New York Times, but I didn't. But interestingly, when I went through it, and I sent it to my Chinese colleagues, and we all agree that it's actually a pretty good article, but it misses a lot. It's missing the technical depth. And almost all the people they interviewed about it were people who have not studied it except anecdotally. And I can't say we've done a deep analysis, but at least we've started. We collected about 350. Basically, what they did, because I was involved in the analysis, not the collection, was they used Google and other things to find things that had been reported on in China as human flesh search activities, or in some other part of the world called, like the Chinese human flesh, and then they got a few synonyms that seemed to work, although very few of those really hit. So it is it's about 350 cases, so it's a decent sample. How statistically significant it is against all possible, I can't answer. In fact, no one can answer. But based on that, they came up with originally this definition, which I've only added a couple words to. You can guess which words. So it's basically a bunch of people trying to accomplish something online, interacting with an offline phenomena. Right. And what's interesting about it, so first of all, so this is the dates of our thing. So you can see it's been a tremendous increasing curve, and they're now collecting 2010 first quarter data, and they say it'll be up higher. So again, it's not huge numbers. This is 60 or 70 in our sample. How many in the real world happen we can't answer. But the other thing that's interesting is you'll notice that there's some humps in this thing. And best we can tell, again, it's not enough data to really be sure of this, it seems like that most of those drop-offs come after something bad happens. So it's used for something good for a while, then somebody comes up with a way to kind of pervert the system. Usage drops off, and then the group sort of finds a way to get around that. So there's been a lot of very interesting self-correction. So for example, the very first cases recorded in China were people doing hideous things in YouTube videos and other people going out in the real world and saying, find who did this, right? So there was one of a woman stomping a little puppy to death, right? And the Chinese actually figured out who she was, where she lived, and made her life hell till she left China, which, for good or bad use, is scary in one way and rewarding in another. Well, but then not too long after, some people started reporting abuses like this when really what they wanted to do was get, their husband, find out who he was, what he was really doing, and that. So if you look at the behavior now, in fact, we'll look at the behavior. Whoops, I'm ahead of myself. So these are the kind of things it's been used for, and unfortunately, I don't have. This is the thing I wish I could drill down in myself because my Chinese doesn't exist to do it. So we're interacting over the ocean to try to get these a little further. But roughly speaking, animal abuses was an early one. We see a little less now. A lot of things about trying to track down rumors about celebrities or where net celebrities are doing things and stuff. So prurient stuff, but nothing too dangerous. Corruption in government has been a big set. Sort of probing ethical issues. So that's things like the poison in the toothpaste. How did that happen? Who was really responsible? So a lot of self-policing kind of things, and also positive ones. So though mostly it's finding out something people don't like. Hit and run accidents. There's a wonderful story where basically somebody reported the accident in the newspaper. A bunch of people who lived there went out and took pictures and posted them to the web and talked about it in chat groups, and some people who actually knew about accident investigation looked at the pictures, figured out some features of the thing, someone in a red car and lived that direction or something. I don't know enough about accident investigation. Some other people who knew about the neighborhood came back on and said, well, these are the car dealers in the neighborhood, and someone said, oh, well, that color paint only happens at that kind of dealer. Typically, someone else would say, who knew a lot about it, would say typically after a hit-and-run accident, the person doesn't drive their car again for a few days. There's usually either a lot of new paint on it or a dent that's not explained. And, they would usually in 3 or 4 days identify who had done it, right? And that was, and originally it took 2 weeks, and it got faster and faster in our data. Again, not enough cases. It was 4% to 350, so there's 12 or 13 cases in there. But again, you're seeing that some really interesting things happening here. The other thing we did is we looked at the kind of offline-online things to see what happened, and this is what I was starting to talk about before. So one of the things that was a self-correct in this system is now pretty much the beginning of most exercises is validating that it's actually happened. Right, so people go out and say, yes, I read this in the newspaper. Yes, I found a YouTube video that shows someone talking about it. Yes, I found something in another language or in another place that says this really happened. Things like that. So typically something happens outside, somebody learns about it, and they kind of announce it to trigger the episode. And then there's various things, cash bounties, things like that. The two I want to mention is that the two that the media reports on the most is that people are motivated by cash, and that it's being used by real-world organizations to get people to do stuff. So the NGOs are saying, help us do some real thing. Most of that came about because when there was the Chinese earthquake, this was used a lot to help get people to the right things, help people find what they needed, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually look at the data categorized by this for the episodes, what you find is that financial reward is almost never. It was almost all in, 3%, some. And it was mostly in the early cases, right? So you see less of it now. And this collaboration with external groups, you see that when it's somebody that's a purposeful group, an Oxfam or something, it doesn't seem to get a lot. However, for example, when the media is investigating something, they'll start talking about in the paper, this thing will take off from that, go and bring back up. So a lot of journalists are starting to figure out sort of how to motivate people to help them expose things by reporting it correct, sort of first in the paper and it moves on, things like that. So it's a very interesting thing. I wish I could get a lot deeper and more data about it. I've had a lot of volunteers since I started talking about it. But unfortunately, I don't own or control the data, so I'm trying to get my colleagues to release all their data, and it's a little tricky because it's named data. In China, it's legal to scrape a forum and publish everything you see, and it's not in some other parts of the world. On the other hand, in China, it's not legal to do some of the other kinds of analyses that we've sort of pushed over to my lab, so the exact release laws would be a little tricky. The other thing that's interesting is if you look at the mathematics of some of these kind of systems, what you see is these community organized ones. In fact, what's interesting is if you look at blogs, wikis, things like that. So there's a well-known mathematics, you probably know about social networks and how they grow and how things disseminate, and each of these, when you look at them, is a little bit different. This one, what's really interesting is very fast growth in an episode almost all around the leaves. So you have a very small hub activity. So it's not like there's a whole lot of people who start these. It seems like there's people start them, they quickly get to one of these hubs, and those are the people who are best at sort of making one really take off. So it's, again, it's a growing group, but we think that's why you don't see a whole lot of these, is because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people who know how to do it yet. So this has led us to think a lot about what's going on there, about some of the topics we've been talking about. So one of the things, and see, this is tricky here because normally I'm talking to computer scientists who understand dynamics and have no clue what governance is. And I have a feeling in this room, I don't have a lot of trouble convincing people governance of online systems is important, but I'll mention it anyway. But to the dynamics, okay, so one of the things that's, I mentioned and said I'd mention a lot is incentives, right? So why are these people doing the flash search? Or why are these people doing Galaxy Zoo? Or why are these people doing Wikipedia, right? Again, we can get some insights, but we don't have that to design knowledge yet. One of the things we found, now I got to say this very carefully. I think this stuff, and I'll say this, at the end, is very, very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, all of the above. But that makes it really, really hard to figure out whether anybody has actually published the definitive paper on this stuff if you're not in one of those communities. But as best I can tell so far, when we were trying to find a lot of references to talk about those things I said before, so what was happening between the offline and the online in the human flesh search, we found a lot of papers that described online and offline in a particular system, but we hadn't found anything that really had a very good, a taxonomy or here's the 27 kinds we've observed. So again, I suspect if I knew what to call it, I'd find more, but there seems to be a dearth of really, so there's a lot of study of online communities and a lot of study of offline communities, but not that much study of how things online are used to motivate things offline and how things offline motivate things online. And one of the things that's been said a whole lot of times about online communities that's really validated in this HFS thing is that you really don't get this expert to novice continuum. So the newspaper publishes, it says, here it is, and everyone says, that's how it is. The collaboration means that somebody who knew a little bit about taking pictures of the scene contributed as much, and you had to get those back and forths going to do it. And again, if you look at Galaxy Zoo and some of those others, very similar kinds of stuff. We talk a lot about trust and distrust on web-based communities, and it's very clear that that's an important issue. But what's interesting is, at least in the computer literature, trust is mostly about controlling or hiding information, so who's allowed to see what. Whereas in these systems, it's mostly about how do people share without getting in trouble. So they seem motivated to share. They want to get their pictures up. They want to be part of that community. Galaxy Zoo says, hey, please come play, and they do. Science is a good motivator. But But again, how do you prevent abuses? And one of the things that was interesting, at least in that system, was that self-correction. Now, could you count on that everywhere? You know, there was some of that in Wikipedia too. When you look at the governance over time, the number of policies is going up. I'll talk about that in a second. Again, to a large degree because it's evolving. So this is, remember that thing I said about evolutionary? This is something we see for real. These communities online that are successful seem to be doing some kind of things start to work, we learn something about it, we fix it, we keep going, as opposed to, you know, they're frozen in a moment in time. Those of you who like to study things using quasi-experimental design and things like that, it's really hard to study something that's co-evolving when you're supposed to be able to freeze it at a particular moment or track it over time and things like that. So how do we even study these is actually hard. The other thing that's interesting is there's been a lot of work and trust in these communities, and strangely, it doesn't seem like the self-reports of who people trust and the academic studies results correlate that well. So, for example, Nashir Contractor has a pretty good study about whether online networks correspond to most of the traditional features of social networks, homophily and things like that, and relations in there that have much more to do with the traditional social networking effects in big multi-user games and things like that, then they look like then they look different from that. So it seems like you still trust people who live around you, even if you don't know they live around you. Things like that, because a lot of these you don't know who the other person is. They do though, because they got data sets from some of the big games. Things like that, and governance, of course. So again, HFS is self-organizing, and that also limits its scale, by the way. So most of these events, we don't actually know the number of people participating, but it's certainly not even into the thousands or millions per event. There may be a lot of them reading it and trying to think about whether they could contribute, but when you actually see who contributed, the numbers seem to be in the tens to hundreds, although there are a few cases where it goes much bigger. But certainly nothing like Galaxy Zoo where they report, 100,000 users. Okay. And this whole thing about governance is, a very interesting thing, and again, I won't talk that much, except to say that, if you study the evolution of governance in Wikipedia, so Butler had a paper in Chi 08, where they reported 44 policies, and so I went to the policy page and counted, and there's now 51. So I can tell you that in 2010 there were 7 more policies. I don't have the history or anything. I could have it. They reported 248 what are called guidelines. There's now over 400. That's not quite, but there was a day where they actually added a whole bunch. So I think it was that they kind of reorganized what were policies and what were guidelines and what were rules and what were so a lot of things in Wikipedia are enforced by software code. So in fact, here's an example. So if you go to the Wikipedia FAQ and you say, how do you prevent people from ruining articles, defacement, or vandalism, they say, software robots automatically reverse obvious defacement immediately. Doesn't say exactly how they know. Moreover, there are hundreds of people who spend a little time each day watching the list of recent changes on Wikipedia, So again, people doing the creative work on on some of them, machines doing a lot of the bulk processing to try to identify things that are obvious, sort of filter them out of the human consideration. And there's a lot of, a lot of reports. There was, so again, one of the problems with a lot of this stuff is a lot of the, quote, definitive work, unquote, has been reported on blogs and things. It's hard to really validate. But one of the things that's very interesting on this one is they're reported to have one of the largest data mining operations anywhere because they have apparently all sorts of rules about, what happens is some kind of bad thing happens and they figure out that you would see that in the history logs by something that hasn't changed for a long time suddenly changing a lot. Or something that changes back and forth. Something where people keep resetting it to an old value should trigger a flag. So they basically have just a bunch of sort of data transaction rules that trigger flags and run that over it. I don't have that on any authority other than rumors. Like that. But it seems likely. Certainly Galaxy Zoo, which has reported this stuff in public, does very much that same kind of thing. So for example, the same person in Galaxy Zoo will be shown the same galaxy periodically. just because then we can calibrate whether there's a learning curve or a reliability within raters. Same galaxy will be shown to many different raters. They've, you know, kind of evolved how many before they will say, you know, if we get 80% of 500 tries, we'll call it the right kind, things like that. So what are the parameters? So again, the humans are doing a lot of the decision making, but you need a computer to check the things, count and stuff. So the computers aren't recognizing the galaxies, but you couldn't organize this human recognition of the galaxies without the computer in the loop. There's a lot of technical challenges in here. I kind of come from the engineering perspective, so this is where a lot of my thinking has been. So one of the things is, it really costs a lot to build and support a scalable governed platform. So compare Wikipedia to HFS and what you need. Now, building the wiki is not hard, but building the monitoring tasks that I just talked about, getting the community going, figuring out how to evolve the governance, seeing what works and doesn't work. Wikipedia now, if you're in the 500 or however many people it is that are sort of their super user community, their special users, they spend, you know, days and days debating on wiki pages what should be the deletion policy. Should we change this DBpedia as a way of linking Wikipedia pages to things in linked data, being used a lot. So when the UK government started announcing it was going to use linked data, some stuff that was kind of bubbling up as a possible thing but largely controversial suddenly started to become much more valuable. So now it looks like a lot more of linked data things will actually be, quote, authorized in a sense. So it's not a, you know, they're allowed to scrape, they're allowed to own things. So there was certain information that was very hard for them to get. They're now going to get that because they're now working closely. I mentioned, you know, games with a purpose are very much not done. But again, large programming challenge, right? I mean, that's really what a lot of this is about. So HFS doesn't seem to do any programming, which limits its scaling, but it's great at that self-organization and that kind of evolution. How could we take that and say a community that's figured out this is a good way to do something, you could kind of express it somehow, and maybe somebody, you know, of a webmaster level of skill as opposed to of a trained programmer level could do it. Maybe we could look at third-party hosting type things, so you don't have to buy a server farm if you want to run any. So the cloud, for example, is now hosting a lot of the data you would need to do some of these things right. Where my real thinking is in this is that there's lots of great so I've been doing this web stuff for a really long time, right? Not more than 20 years, I promise, but 17, 18 explicitly. And early in the days of the web, you know, you heard again and again that no one would ever use this thing because look at this beautiful ebook, look at this wonderful research project, look at this great example I have here of a hypertext that was much, much better than the web. Or look at Ted Nelson's work in the early 90s, early 80s, where he talked about, you know, you must have links that have things at both ends because you're going to have some kind of micropayment scheme. And, you know, sort of I click a link and it's not there, who pays who doesn't pay, you know, who broke something, which turns out to, in the long run, have been one of the really limiting factors that kept his Xanadu system from becoming the web, was that turns out the real scalability comes by saying you can't guarantee that, and then later trying to fit better mechanisms to at least make it better on top. So again, so it was and you know, HTML is a lousy text markup language compared to all the other ones that were around at the time. It was easy to use, it was easy to cut and paste, it was not too hard to get started, but oh man, SGML, call it XML now, is much better, right, for a lot of reasons. The problem is, you know, the lightweight, pretty good solution for a lot of people work. We see the same thing in the semantic web. Okay, I'm putting my semantic web hat on for a minute. But if you look at the data gov stuff, if you look at what's mostly been the successful deployments of semantic web, and now I can claim that because you've had companies like Google and Microsoft and you know, Oracle and IBM saying nice things about the semantic web in the past year, and a lot of startups saying nice things about linked data, and governments like yours saying linked data is the best thing we've seen till till we see the next thing.
Do we see the next government?
Sorry.
Do we see the next government?
Right. So again, you know, a lot of what was the hardest part of making the semantic web work, and this is probably not too controversial when I say it in most audiences, but I have to be careful if I walk over to the other side of campus and say this. But what we see in the pickup is not a lot of use of the heavy expressive AI knowledge rep stuff, but a very little bit of that coupled with a whole lot of data. Now that's just where we are today. I mean, you know, maybe it'll change someday. If any of you work for Ian Horrocks, you can tell him I said that. But it seems to me that what we've seen is very much now a model that once a lot of these standards got there, once we got some of the query languages right, things like that, is really taking off, in part because it's a pretty easy way to grab a bunch of data, throw it together, throw a visualization on it, something like that. So my group has been taking the data.gov from the US, which isn't released with the Sparkle endpoint, sort of turning it into Sparkle and then doing our own visualizations. And we basically just take a Sparkle query, take the out. If you don't want to know what it means, don't worry about it. We take a query, we take the output, we pipe it into a Google visualization. They can be creative, they can have lots of things in them, they can have very few things. But we've created lots of these using you know, a few students who really had very little background in this stuff when they started. And in fact, I always bring, every time we start a new demo or a new data set, it's usually a new student, and these are usually undergraduates. I mean, so we're not talking rocket science. We're talking, it's still not, you know, push this button, turn it on, but it's getting a lot easier. It's sort of, I'd say at the moment, it is at that webmaster level, right? You can cut, if you know a little bit about this stuff, you can, we post our queries, you can cut and paste them to make it work for another data set, and it will go right into the right Google visualizer, the pie chart or the graph or things like that. I should, you know, again, all day long today I've been telling people about what we've been doing and showing them this, and people have been excited because they're not great visualizations, but they're easy. So, you know, you have some data set you've been using for a lot of years, you can finally look at it and see if it looks right before you have to start running a lot of the statistical packages, because you still have to validate and you still need real data things. I'm not trying to say any of that stuff is wrong, but you have a whole lot of data out there now. There are thousands of data sets being released by your government and thousands being released by my government, and other governments are following on. So if you want to plot the number of libraries versus the weather versus the average income versus the smoking incidence in the US, you can have that data now. You don't have to do any collection. It's already been released for you. But you have to figure out how to pull it together, query it, and visualize it. And that's the thing that, because of this technology, is a lot easier than it is in traditional data technologies. You don't have to model it in the same level. You don't have to worry about the fact that you don't know what these 27 relations are if you're not going to use them, things like that. So you really need a much simpler level to get up to step. And you can co-evolve a lot better, cut and paste, all that sort of stuff. So I think that what would really be, you know, exciting is, and we think actually maybe some of this government data to citizen involvement would be a good place to look at some of this, is to really study some of these evolving communities. Who's using it? What are they doing with it? What motivates them? Things like that. So there's a technical challenge that takes us right back to that social challenge I talked about before. What do people do with this stuff? I'm not going to talk much about, I'll talk about this slide, but not the next four. We're also trying to actually play some of the game of actually, you know, doing some theory and science and analysis underlying this stuff. So we brainstormed some things and sort of clustered them at one point, and now based on the Chinese stuff, I've tried to pull it together. So this is some of what we're doing, but really it's only the highest level bullets you need to see. So one of the things is we got to figure out tools that allow groups of users to sort of do what Wikipedia does. So not the wiki part, but here's how our community organizes. You grab our rules, you put it in your system, and it more or less works the same way, right? So I can get MediaWiki, which is the thing Wikipedia works on, but I have to read hundreds and hundreds of human-readable things to guess their policies, and I still don't know which ones would work for me. I can't try them, right, very easily. So making some of this tools, things like that. There's a lot of scaling issues here, and I think that's all I'm going to say about that one. And I think a really exciting place where sort of the social and technical comes together is in this whole issue of how do we get some protocols that are, let you know when you're using this system that they kind of conform to the policy expectations of the user, right? This thing, if you give me your time to help solve these astronomy projects, you're pretty willing to believe that, when you're saying this galaxy is a spiral galaxy, that no one's going to care except some astronomer, right? But if you're saying, this person lives next door to me and, doesn't, and I hear their dog barking at night, then there's suddenly a social expectation that starts to grow, and we need to understand those and how to do it. So transparency of this stuff, accountability. So it turns out on the web, very often the mechanisms don't actually have to be an enforcement mechanism in the sense of here's a bunch of rules and it's built into the web protocols, because it's really hard to do that. The web protocols are built to sort of allow anybody to do anything. But you can do things like, if you have pages on your website that you would like search robots not to search, you put a document up at the top of your hierarchy that says, please don't search here. Right, there's a format you're supposed to use. Okay. And the search engine comes and it's supposed to read that, look at it, and if it, and then not go to that page. Now, no enforcement mechanism. However, it turns out to be the case that if you go look at your logs for those pages, you can see if there's been something crawling it. And if there is, you can take that IP address and you can throw it in your thing and say, don't let that in here anymore. Right? So in a sense, there's a way for individuals to kind of socially individuals to technically recognize something going on. Well, companies like Google and actually Yahoo, one point, some others, realized that it would be really bad if people say, hey, look, these guys don't respect the protocol. So they're very careful, at least as far as we know, to observe those protocols, with a few exceptions. Turns out wikis don't work right, and some other things. So Yahoo tends to search a lot of our wiki pages. Google only searches half of the, it's weird rules like that. So we don't know what's going on, but at least we can tell. And we can report on that in our blogs or in our tweets or in our, research papers, which means that there's a reason people want to be careful about it. Some people have been playing with Facebook, Danny Weitzner at MIT, with just putting a little thing on your page that says, I will be very mad at you if you ever use this for health reasons or for job reasons or things like that. And the hope is that if a lot of people did that and some company starts using Facebook and the word gets out, the company would be worried about that and therefore would be much more hesitant to do Facebook stalking as a hiring practice, right? So again, a social means. Now, how would you know? Well, somebody who didn't get the job reports it. You may not worry. 14,000 people who didn't get jobs start reporting this. You begin to wonder. So again, that's some of the kinds of social mechanisms that could be designed and enforced if we understood this stuff better. This is the stuff I'm mostly going to skip, except to say that the basic stuff in communication networks and things like that is not traditionally very computational, so it's hard to define a social machine on top of it. So we've actually been looking at the base of some of this to say, how do you bring semantics into some of those basic models so that essentially what we'd really like is that the social machine sits on top of some kind of model where you can talk about things like shared understanding, shared knowledge, ability to tell things. Clearly there's cultural issues in here. Where would you can't put that representation down at the level of which bits are moving where. So we spend a lot of our time trying to kind of recreate that, and if we better understood that, so this is what my funders are funding, so I have to put those in my slides. This is, I think, the more important thing, which is who do you need to be able to do this right? And my belief is everybody, who's interested, right? Clearly there's psychological effects, physics in the sense of, the Barabasi's kind of social network model. These things are big. You can't study them, with a, please ask everybody who ever uses Galaxy Zoo to tell you what they did. Right, they have some feedback. But again, they can only use it anecdotally. The engineering, technology, social science community. So again, in a lot of places, this would look odd. I just met 6 6 of your grad students today, and I think they cover all 6, so I don't have to say more about that here. There's a lot of other related technical detail I haven't sort of drilled down into, and mostly this is stuff my lab's doing, but to say that, I'm basing some of these things that are speculative on at least some experience of playing with these technologies, so we know that it's at least theoretically possible to do some of this stuff in a declarative way with policies. We know sort of a little bit about this modeling. One that's very interesting, it's not work I've done, is one of my former students, Jennifer Goldbeck at UMCP, has looked at the actual dynamics of some real social networks. And it's out-of-date work, as most of this stuff is by the time it's published. But she actually went every day to various social networks and counted users, plotted it on sort of some of the standard plotting software, and looked for anomalies. So those are the red dots. And what's interesting is you see in a lot of these curves something. And then she went back to those dates about those things and tried to correlate them. You can't see it in this, but some of these are very large networks. Some of these are very small networks. So this is Dogster, which is your dog's Facebook, Catster, which has a few less, which is your cat's Facebook, and Hamsterster. Hamster's Facebook. So Hamsterster only has a few hundred pets at the time she did it. Dogster, I think, had a few thousand. Yes, people will go online and have friends and chats between their dogs and claim the dogs are doing it. But they grow almost exactly the same as the others, except that, like this one is my favorite. This is a commercial that was aired during the football Super Bowl. So you see growth like this, shoot up, and then the same growth you had before that happening just now at the top. Right, so again, you can see a lot of interesting effects that we haven't really studied very well because we've studied the mathematics of these things, or we've studied the individual networks and not really looked so much at the social effects as represented through that stuff. So that's something she's very interested in, we've been playing with lately. Enough of this stuff. So I'm going to, more or less stop there. So the summary is, we think that there's a new technology that we're really getting close to. I mean, we're starting to see real examples, although they're still very domain specific, they're very expensive, and they're very hard to build, but that let really large numbers of users interact over the web to collectively solve problems. And I believe that we really are where we can start to talk, with the right research communities coming together in the right way, I think we can really start talking about what would it mean to build and run one of these, how would you do it, what kind of things. And in fact, if you look at some of the things like Ning and stuff, which do lots and lots of social networks, one of the problems is sort of a lot of people start them and then they kind of die out. There hasn't been a study of what did and didn't work, but one of the things that seems to me clear is if that data was more transparent, we might be able to study it and figure out some of that stuff. So there's a lot of work to be done in just understanding the stuff. As I said, a lot of good examples out there, and I really believe that this is a good example of one of these really interdisciplinary challenges that's motivated totally by the changes the web has made and how we live our lives. So it's very easy to take old ways of doing science and apply it to the web in your field. But when you really want to take a new emerging web phenomenon and understand it and engineer it and use it, I mean, it seems like it really now takes us understanding that thing at a lot of levels. We understand now that sort of web science mantra that those of you who know Dame Wendy Hall have heard a lot of times. The engineering, the analysis, and the social have to really come together, and I think this is just a good example of that. So I'm going to stop there. And again, what I really hope is that some of you will be motivated from this, especially if there's students in the room, to get excited by some of these problems. If you're postdocs or even old professors like me, you might find some of this stuff interesting, and we might be able to say, so I think we can make this real. I think we're where we know how to get started and don't really know where it's going to go, and I think that's what's so exciting. So thank you.
Extremely interested whether they were understanding or not. You get the point. Pretty good thing to do that. Or we pass this back. Who wants to talk? To ask questions, sorry. We pass it back. Just
So, is it working?
Yes.
Okay. I noticed that most of what you've talked about here has been purely about information and social matters, and it doesn't touch at all the physical world. And I mention this because I've recently come across some work by Adrian Bowyer at Bath University, who's building machines that can manufacture half of their own parts at very low cost. And it seems to me that this is an additional piece of the kind of puzzle you're talking about, which feeds this cooperative community work back into the physical world. Do you have any comment?
No, I got my own mic. No, I think that's a brilliant thought, and I have to think about it hard. It hasn't been the direction I'm going, both in reporting back, but also in terms of, what I will tell you is what I know about some of that work and some of the evolutionary mechanisms they use in the learning and things like that. I think some of that stuff may actually be stuff that would be very interesting to try here. But and obviously I'm very interested in the offline-online, since in a sense that seems to be the thing that motivates a lot of this, is solving a real-world problem in the online space. But having said that, I really have no idea how the physical to the and particularly because the cyber world and the real world have very different scaling factors. So my guess is we'd have to do a fair amount of thinking and brain brashing to even get it to a tight enough question that I could say something. But that would be my starting place, is that, the real problem is on the web, it's really easy to talk about 100,000 people doing something. In the real world, that's like building the pyramids. I forget, maybe it's 1 million, I forget what the big number is in that. Right. But, sort of Facebook, in a sense, in terms of just sort of the number of humans touching it to, quote, do something, to accrete its knowledge, right, is the biggest number of anybody doing anything, anywhere, modulo, I'm hand-waving, right? But certainly it's as big as, it's a pretty big thing. 400 million people have rarely done anything, right? So again, I mean, it seems like there's some interesting questions there, but also that there's some interesting differences. So also studying the differences might be very interesting. Bill?
No, I'm just carrying the mic.
Well, too late, you have to ask. That's the rule.
I'm just trying to digest everything, but there's one of the things that I didn't hear throughout the whole talk, and it was a huge amount of information, but it's just about power. There's something that you can comment on that, because I think it's a huge issue now that we are getting to this understanding.
So power in the sense of human relation power?
Yeah,
exactly.
basically that, and just in the real, I'm coming back to the real world, how it's going to be deployed, where we are at that point, these kind of things, because you are just advancing in one dimension of the society if you want, as a scientist.
Yeah, and in fact, I probably should, someday I should probably throw in the slides of the stuff that keeps me awake at night, right? Like, what if the Nazis are a lot better at using this stuff than I am because they're, have some inherent, ability to follow orders better or something, I don't know, and, make up your favorite. But, yes, but on the other hand, I would say two things. One is the real world is a very interesting self-correcting thing sometimes, and the real serious aberrations, though there are way too many of them, are actually comparatively rare, right? So there's always somebody being slaughtered, but if you can think of all the people you'd like to slaughter who you don't, right? I mean, in a certain sense, it's the amazing thing is that we're as well behaved as we are in some ways. So. But on the web, what's interesting is places where abuse of power happens are often, again, as I mentioned, they have that sort of self-correction because there's a lot of other people out there. So, I used to use the example in a lot of my talks about this was back in the Alta Vista days, so Google didn't exist yet, but I talked about sort of what it would take real agents to work and what language issues we'd have to deal with and why we needed data in there and things like that. And somebody had once suggested the question to me of, supposing you wanted to ask the web how many cows are in Texas, it should give you this answer. And I said, no, it shouldn't. It should give you a bunch of answers. And we had an argument. So I went to Alta Vista and I typed how many cows are in Texas. And among the top 20 hits was a site that says there are none. Right? Now, if you understand that the largest beef producer outside of South America is Texas, that seems like an odd thing. So I went to look at that site. It seemed interesting. And what it said was that all the cows in Texas have essentially been replaced by alien symbiotes, and that's why you shouldn't eat meat. Okay, so it was a radical vegetarian ufologist website, and that was early enough in the web that I actually believed they were serious, right? But the interesting thing about it is I realized that to someone in the world, I'm a radical vegetarian ufologist. And it became to me the most important web search I ever did, because it totally changed my idea about what the web is and how it works. And in a sense, you have to support everybody who wants to do something. If that means bad things happen, then we have to use real world mechanisms to correct them rather than kicking people off, because if they get power, they'll kick us off. And part of what balances that power is nobody can kick anyone else off. So I think, but that's a good example. So in Wikipedia, they can kick you off. But of course, you can create a new account. It's just you lose, your ability to fix some things you've done before. Some people have more power. So they've got a government, right? There's, sort of the minister of commas. He doesn't call it that, but and in fact, in some of the books about Wikipedia, you find some great anecdotes in some of the papers. Like, again, this guy who all his life was one of those nerds who said no one knows how to use commas right? Suddenly became an amazingly powerful Wikipedia user because he went through page after page fixing the commas, right? And no one had ever given him positive feedback for fixing commas before, and rose up to be a major user. Now again, that's sort of anecdotal, but I think there's exciting potential because of lots of people doing it. At the same time, there's potential abuses because it's powerful technology, and that's one of the things I'd love to see explored in this. And I think the notion of what power is online is a very. I was telling Bill today. There's some guys who were talking. I think it was, but talking to me about a project they're really interested in, which is how do we even track who's an influential Twitterer or blogger? Right? We have intuitions about it, but if I want to put something to somebody who has a lot. Was an advertiser kind of thing. So if I have a new innovation in a car motor, right, that's less pollution producing, he says, I know from magazines who will be interested. I know for reporters what reporter is most likely to report on that and will have the most readers. So I can actually think about how to get the word out for a client. He says, we go to the new media. I mean, we got study after study, but we still can't even answer the basic question of, who would you ask in general, let alone who would you ask a particular thing? Right? We know who has how many followers and things, but
you
we
need
don't.
the very high ratios of followers to follow, don't you?
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. It turns out, I suspect Barack Obama, who has almost exactly the same amount of followers, and probably it's because they do an auto-follow, if he said on his blog that something is important, it would have a lot more influence than I did, and my balance is more the ratio you want. Of course, it's a smaller number. So it's really hard to. It's really surprisingly hard to answer. And we know there's power laws, and we know there's long-tail
What
distribution.
about retweets?
Well, in fact, those of you who Twitter a lot know that a few months ago, how retweets work changed, right? And it turns out what that does is it leaves a cookie trail it leaves a trace in the database that Twitter maintains that wasn't there before. So the problem was because of the character limitation, if I saw something Yorick did and I reported, I usually said from Yorick. And then the next person who saw that and wanted to retweet it might say, well, I can't fit both Jim and Yorick anymore, so I'll either take out Yorick and put in Jim, because that's what I got from, or I'll take out Jim and leave Yorick, because he's the one who originally did it. The new model, those things accrete. You may not actually see them in the tweet, but they're in the tweet database, so they know who started, and that's why they're doing it, because they think that's where they're going to make their money, is out of figuring out exactly this question of, which unfortunately means probably they're not going to tell us. They're not going to give us access to that. In fact, through the API now, you can get almost everything in Twitter except that retweet information. It doesn't give it to you in a computable form yet.
Yes, I was thinking. I'm just trying to do my best to link your area of research to what I'm studying. I'm just doing an MBA right now here in Oslo. So, but one of the things that I study and understood is issues about the market, how the market is at some point is like the collapse, if you want, of a lot of expectation of the value of something. Is that a good metaphor of that?
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So I understand.
It's just I was trying to introduce it.
Yeah.
So.
You have a question?
The question is coming.
It's
And
hard.
when we talk about when we
talk
talk about the market, when we start talking about the market, we start seeing about not a virtual world, a real world with its own dynamics, its own dynamics of power, and that's what really concerns me. And also we see the political or business movements of beings trying to understand all these technologies, okay, but who are way ahead. I mean, you think about the discussion of the telecommunication carrier, for instance, who are the ones who are sustaining all this system, and they're saying, okay, what happens here if we don't have any value? We are not able to extract any value of the system. Who's going to invest it? For such a big scale systems, the marginal cost goes to zero, and so who wants to invest? So you have all these real issues, I think, about this system that's sustaining our economy to some extent.
I think you're exactly right. In fact, when I give my sort of generic web science spiel, why we need to study the web from a lot of different perspectives, I like to use the example that in the States, it was proposed a couple of years ago that they allow the ISPs to have a differential charging model. So Google could pay them a bunch of money and their packets would get through faster, right? And if you went to the electrical network, as many countries have, and said, what if we were to reward people for investing in green or alternate energy? You have a whole bunch of economists who've developed technology working with a whole bunch of electrical engineers and math and stuff that can actually answer the question. The bad news is you can get 6 or 8 or 80 answers from different models, but at least they have models. At least they have a reason to say why they believe that answer and things like that. And so at least there's a knowledge underlying those decisions to inform the policies and politics. When you look at a lot of this stuff, like net neutrality, what really carried the day was Tim Berners-Lee started saying in a whole lot of talks that got reported in a whole lot of newspapers that it was a bad idea. And a whole lot of politicians decided they didn't want to vote right at that particular time. The other thing was, the ISPs said yes. The actual interestingly, Google and Yahoo and some of those guys opposed it. Whereas intuitively, you might think it would be just the opposite. Wouldn't they like their packets to get? No, because in fact, what they like is the fact that lots and lots of people use their stuff, right? Not that only the people who pay more would use their stuff. Right. In fact, Google believed it would put them out of business to a large degree because the selling of advertising is all about commercializing the rare searches, not the easy to figure out what advertisement to put on the search that Britney Spears to the Britney Spears album is not a rocket science, but a search you've never seen before with words that have never been combined, figuring out what ad to put on is what Google makes its money off of. So again, very complicated story. I'll give you one anecdote that really I found interesting about this is, so I was saying that in a web science meeting one time, and just by coincidence, we had 2 economists who were invited, and one of them could come on Wednesday and one of them could come on Thursday. And the guy who came on Wednesday at the end of the day, I think you were there, basically said, there's nothing new in this stuff. Right, we know all about these models and incentives and long tails, and you guys are saying this stuff is different. You're just wrong. You just got to get the numbers. Give us the parameters. It's just not. I love what you're doing, but it's just not interesting from an economic perspective. And we were all a little depressed about that until the next guy walked in the morning and started his keynote by saying, the web is totally different than any economic system we have ever studied. Right. I don't know who's right, but the fact that you can have that much and some other ones. I mean, I actually had a slide I took out of this because this talk was getting too long. There were 2 studies done in the past 3 months about whether men or women use Facebook. It was just Facebook. Use Facebook more, right? Both of which had very large surveys done, right? One of them came out, I think it was 53-47 men, which was the surprising thing because there was a belief women did more. The other one was something like 57-43 women. Okay, now they used virtually the same methodology. Now I haven't seen the questionnaires, and I suppose a lot of you guys who know this stuff better would study it and could say, this is part of why that happened. If you go out and a colleague of mine said, you know, can you help me figure out what percentage of Twitter users are 65 or over? So I happen to know where a lot of that literature is. So I went and pointed her at some studies. She said, that was great. I said, why? Did you find the answer? She said, no, I found 4 answers, and they all disagree with each other. Right? So again, I mean, even things that seem pretty straightforward, we don't know the answer. And that's just self-reports of age, let alone how old people really are. So, you know, I mean,
Mrs. Thatcher.
I've used your question to go off in a different direction, I know that. But what I really believe is that understanding the web. So my colleagues who do agents on the web got into markets a few years ago. And I think it's great because none of them now compete with me for doing interesting stuff about the web. They're doing great stuff about markets and auctions and things like that. It's just, I don't see how any of it's going to actually apply online to these kind of, so again, there's a lot to be studied, but we really got to learn how to study it in the context of these much more complex, large-scale phenomena.
Your point about economists, Mrs. Thatcher, whenever she said something about economics that was not all that popular, she always said that was exactly that point. She always said that if she asked any economist, she got 10 answers, and for her that was the definitive reason for not ever speaking to economists. But I'd like to care about your point about the human flesh search engine. I mean, one of the things I liked about that, I mean, I've heard of it obviously, but your analysis was that it picks up a point in recent Chinese political tradition that I'd forgotten all about, because you made the point, I think, that the flesh search engine is basically a people-powered thing as opposed to the heavy programming platforms that you contrasted with. And of course, for people who are old enough to remember the Cultural Revolution, one of the key points of the Cultural Revolution was that China should go for things that were entirely people-powered. So birds were wiped out in Beijing by everybody coming out and killing birds on the same day, and the birds had nowhere to land because the whole population was out. And Mao had a theory about steel production, which was slightly silly, but not totally silly, which was that steel could be produced in backyards. You didn't need steelworks. That steel could be produced by people power rather than by high tech, because it was his way of getting one up on Western technology. Okay, that's all the past. But what I like about the human flesh search engine is, even though the Cultural Revolution now has a very low market price, this is a sense, a reversion to those ideas that China should adopt mass-centered technologies rather than technology-centered technologies. Rather nice.
Yeah, well, and I think just not. I agree with everything you said, except maybe even not just China.
No.
The other thing, by the way, is I didn't talk about. I don't have evidence for this other than that I've now been sort of. So I've given this talk a couple practice times, last Friday at an NSF workshop and today for the first time in public. But on Monday I put my slides on SlideShare and they got a whole lot of hits. And look, and I've been getting a lot of email from people about HFS because there's not a lot out there about it. And what's really interesting is a lot of my cultural perceptions of why it worked and things like that seem very different. So, you know, one of the people said, you know, you got to realize that in China, part of what people are getting out of this is the thrill of doing something that's essentially illicit. Whereas for us, we wouldn't even think of this as illicit at all. And I mean, you know, reporting what media people are saying and doing, you know, I mean, but, you know, so there's that issue. So there's a ability to fix your, you know, feeling powerless, feeling a way to fix your society and being able to do it. Meanwhile, one of my Chinese graduate students who heard that said, no, not at all. It's this other thing. And so I've seen 3 or 4, you know, again, it's a thing where it's very clear to me that that the things that were obvious to me about it are probably wrong. I don't know what's true. And I think it'd be wonderful to get more data and really study it a lot better. But clearly, you know, you see cultural biases and these kind of things that we would need to understand. There's a Galaxy Zoo story I could tell you, which would take a while, but the fast part of it is, turns out they were getting a very funny astronomical result that turned out to be an artifact of how they designed their interface. And they discovered this because someone reported it at a meeting where an interface designer happened to be in the audience. He said, oh, you know, when people don't know, they always hit the middle button. Are you randomizing the button order? You know, it says to do that on page 2 of the HCI handbook. And the guy said, "There's an HCI handbook." You know, I mean, again, it's very much one of these things we have to learn how to work together because you know, again, doing this is not easy. But I think
So these guys changed the universe by not. Not writing
well,
like
well, dinner, drinks. It's a good story. But roughly speaking, yes, they actually had 3 or 4 astronomical papers in preparation. One of them out for review at Nature, about the distribution of galaxies not being as we expected it when the guy presented this thing to the HCI guy. So, well, now I've told the story. But
Just the people who haven't spoken who want to speak.
We're finished? If I can, maybe a last question, or towards the last, just to be maybe somewhat provocative on social machines, because I always get annoyed when people talk about social media as something new. I mean, electronic mail is social, and that has always been the core of the internet. It's always been a social media platform. But the other is this point about mass versus these are really new, but many of these collaborative technologies are finding the 1 or 2 people who could solve the problem. So they're not, you know, it's the governance issue, I guess I would stress. Like maybe 2 or 3 people might edit a Wikipedia article, or InnoCentive is about finding the one person who can best solve a problem. So it's not necessarily mass production of content or solving it. It's how these systems sort through distributed populations to find the small group of people who can apply themselves to some. It's the allocation of work rather than mass work.
well, but again, you know, I think you're right. I also think you're wrong. And what I mean by the wrong part is, here's Galaxy Zoo, which is a counterexample to, I think, to what you just said. There are a few astronomers who figured out how to build the system, but in terms of sort of who reports what and how it builds into the database of what galaxies look like, there really are no 2 or 3 people who are better at it than anyone else. Hanny was no better than anyone else on Galaxy Zoo.
No better, but
So-
even the translation of the documents, that didn't, how many people translate each word? Do they have, they probably
I
have
don't
1
know.
or 2 people that maybe guess what these words are, and it's this allocation, and it's really quite
No, I'm saying,
impressive.
but Wikipedia clearly has a structure that's different than the structure Galaxy Zoo
Yeah,
has. So the part we're in total agreement is studying this governance is critical to understanding this stuff. But at the same time, the thing that I think is new here, or let me rephrase that, newer, okay? The thing that doesn't work very well when you say telephone or television or fax machine is very much this notion. So it's why I started with Tim's definition and tried to nail it down a little bit, is that, you know, it's again letting humans do what humans do best and machines do what machines do best. And in the telephone, the machine isn't really doing anything except routing the voice. And in Galaxy Zoo, the computer is actually figuring out who sees what, when, how many times, what gets put into the database. So it's much less. It's much more a machine in the traditional sense of the machine. I don't mean in the physical sense.
Less social.
Less so. Yes, exactly. Whereas when you look at something like Wikipedia, you have a machine, the software robots that help them manage it, but human knowledge is in. But for example, you know, I put something on and it got auto-deleted. And, you know, I put a comment in the right place to say, why was this, and no one answered it. Because it turns out that auto-delete thing goes so fast that it takes them months to catch up. But so then not too long after, a thing came out on Wikipedia that said, if you want to be, you know, have an auto-delete and you don't like it, redo it and do this to it. You know, put the special characters around it, and that won't cause us not to delete it, because, you know, we think it's copyrighted material and we're not willing to have it. But it means we'll enter a discussion with you and we'll tell you where to put your, and I went in, I put the thing saying, you know, but this is my content, and they're like, well, you have to put a license on it. And I'm like, well, but I can't put a license on it because I don't control the server, I only control the material, right? And things like that. So again, you could have a discussion, but you had to go through the machine had to kind of let them know you were someone who would. So again, it's a level of the machine. I view it more as the machine supporting the social processes of humanity. I have a feeling that someday, 20 years from now, when I look at what we've wrought, I'm going to feel like boy, that was as naive as when I said, this web thing is pretty good for sort of flat data, but it's never going to really take off for video and things like that. I mean, almost everybody's prediction about the web was wrong. So.
Can I come back on that point? Because sorry, I know it's the end, Bill, but you've just reminded me. There's a student doing research here. Sorry. Thank you. There's a student doing a thesis here, and his thesis is this point about the machine and how much the machine is, as it were, has social implications. It's in itself, in its mechanism. There's a student who's not in the room, but if I remember his work right, he's investigating, as it were, he's having to do it by reverse engineering because it's not declared. He's investigating the algorithm by which Facebook presents your friends to you when you access Facebook. Those of you who are Facebook users know that you get different orders in different days, and there's a rationale, a very strong rationale behind it. And by reverse engineering, he believes that the algorithm probably is that people that come top are those who are accessing you. In other words, Facebook may be, by its presentation, or revealing who are your stalkers. Anyway, I'm not sure what is the result, but I'm just raising this because if so, here's a piece of the machine, but it has extraordinary social implications if known. I mean, I thought it was quite an interesting piece of work.
That's interesting. But again, just maybe this is a good way to bring it to an end, because you guys will feel good about this. But I actually asked to come give this talk here. Right. I mean, normally I'm asked to give colloquials. Yorick asked me to be here 3 or 4 times. No, I'm saying Yorick has asked me in the past to come talk here many times, but this time I extended a trip a day so I could come up and present this here, because I think this is really the one organization in the world where I feel, well, one of a few, where people would understand that these things coming together is very powerful, and B, have some real insights about different ways to think about some of these problems. And I've really enjoyed the QA because you've asked me things I didn't have pat, cute answers for, or I've given you a pat, cute answer because I didn't know how to answer your real question. But I think the value of an entity like this that's really trying now to look at getting people like Bill and Yorick in the same room is really wonderful. So I applaud you, Bill, for what you've created here. And I just wish I could stay here for days talking to everybody, because everybody I've talked to today about one or the other of the projects I'm doing has had great insights that I don't get being at an engineering school. So.
Well, on that note, as we thank you, we're proposing to go for a drink, and we shall go out of the door and we shall turn right. And about 100 yards to the right is the Lamb and Flag. Is drinks all right, isn't it? Yeah. So if anybody would like to go on talking...
No, please.
No. I'm dragging Jim up the street to have a drink. And anybody who'd like to go on talking to Jim and general discussion, you'll be extremely welcome to join us. Can I thank you on your behalf?